In a post-COVID world, U.S. school administrators, educators, and students face challenges that demand innovative solutions. Agile's Educator Insight video series, Education Matters, spotlights classroom perspectives from educators who have met educational challenges and exceeded expectations through extraordinary strides in academic intervention services, achievements, and learning recovery. In part one of this year's video series, hosted by Agile's Ali Newcomb, we connect with Meredith Biesinger to discuss IEP and 504s and how educators have not only met these challenges, but exceeded them by redefining success in education, offering a blueprint for educators nationwide. IEP and 504s require a team of educators and parents rallying behind the student.
Well, Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today and for our discussion. So today we are going to be talking about educational plans that outline accommodations and support for students with disabilities, specifically individualized education programs or IEPs and 504s. So these are two different plans that do function differently and serve students in different ways. So we're going to break down those differences and the important features and functions so that parents or educators can really understand how and when those should be applied, but they work in different ways. But luckily, we have your wisdom and expertise to help us understand that better and really understand their different functions and why it's important to really understand the specifics of each. So again, thank you for being here today to walk us through this. And do we want to start with IEPs and basically what these are?
Sure, of course. Thank you for having me. Okay, so IEPs, the differences between IEP and 504, they're the same, but they're different. So it's good to get some clarification on this. An IEP, first of all, is the acronym IEP is for Individualized Education Program. And it's specific for an individual student who has a documented disability. And what an IEP does is it provides interventions, accommodations, modifications to help the student thrive in a learning setting, whether that's in a traditional classroom setting, a smaller classroom setting. When you're working with IEPs, there's a wide range. You could have a student that has maybe a speech IEP and they just get speech intervention, but they're in, a traditional classroom setting. Or you could have a student with a lot of severe medical and mental disabilities. And so they are in, an entire special education program. And so their IEP is going to look very different than the student that, maybe needs speech. And so I think that's what's confusing. Sometimes people hear IEP and they think automatically it's special education and they think of severe special education needs. But an IEP is there to support the student with any kind of disability, whether that's OT, PT, speech, maybe they have ADHD, all the way to severe special needs. And so an IEP is there to help the student. It's there to serve as a guide for teachers and for parents with goals for the student to accomplish throughout the year and an action plan as to, how they're going to accomplish those goals.
Okay. So it sounds like with IEPs, it's really a spectrum. It can be, something very specific, a singular, or, all the way up to students who, have more either a combination of needs for accommodation needs or, need like full special education accommodation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, then what about 504s? Can you walk us through how those work and which students they serve?
Yes. Okay. So 504, again, you're working with students with disabilities, but there's a little more breathing room there with 504s. Section 504 is the American with Disabilities Act, and it's a plan. It's a plan that is developed with teachers and parents in the best interest of the student. An example of this, in some states, dyslexia is not recognized as a learning disability. But if a child has documentation from a doctor or a specialist that they have dyslexia, then they can get a 504 to get reading intervention while they're in the classroom and while they're in school, so that they can help with their reading and get that dyslexia intervention that's needed. Again, things that fall under 504 can be a lot of like ADHD, things like that. And those modifications and accommodations more are like extra time on tests, a quiet place to take tests. If you have a student who has been diagnosed with anxiety, there has to be documentation there that they have anxiety from a doctor. But if they have that documentation, then they can get modifications to their school day to help them in the classroom setting. So, a quiet place to take the test, or if they need notes read to them or they need help taking notes, things like that. It just ensures appropriate accommodation for the individual student, but it's to a lesser degree.
Would it be accurate as sort of in a comparison or differentiating between the two? 504s are a little more like setting and context specific, whereas IEPs would be broader.
Yes. I'm going to give an example. I'm going to use my son, so there's no, FERPA issues here or anything. Okay. So my son had an IEP for several years for speech. And he, exited that IEP after 5 years, but still felt like he needed a little bit of help in the classroom to take tests. He's a perfectionist. There's a little bit of, anxiety there. And so we went from an IEP, which gave him different interventions as well as speech therapy, to a 504, where he now just takes tests in a small group setting that's a little more quiet and a little less, intimidating for him, if that makes sense. That's an example of the difference between an IEP and a 504 in one instance. There's so many instances out there, but both need documentation too. So an IEP and a 504 both need documentation from, depending on the situation, a physician or a specialist, and then teachers, the school district special education, director or department all meet and agree upon this and to create the plan.
It sounds like understanding and the breakdowns of these and how they work is not just something that's important to the educators and administrators in schools, but you mentioned several times you need documentation from a doctor, a physician, or a pediatrician, or a therapist. So parents, obviously, that they have to be engaged for, plans to be put in place. And so can you talk a little bit about how parents are or can be involved in the process, and I guess any advice you have for them?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the first thing, I'm glad we're doing this because, maybe there will be a parent or several out there. Sometimes we throw these acronyms around or numbers, and we just expect people to know, oh yeah, they might need an IEP, or let's talk about a 504. Okay, well, what is that? If you're a parent that's never gone through that process before, what does that even look like? And so typically it begins with a conversation between, a teacher and administrator. Maybe they're concerned about the student and they think that student needs some kind of help. They can't really say, I think your student has, A, B, or C, but they express the concerns there. And at that point, let's just use the instance really common with ADHD. The parent would then consult a doctor about ADHD. They would go through that process. There's screening and testing and things like that. And if the physician feels that student has that, then they get that documentation, they take it to the school submits it to the school district. And then there's a meeting between the special education department with the district, and then a classroom teacher representative, a special education teacher that works at that specific school, a school administrator, and then at least one parent or guardian. And then you meet together and you discuss the needs that this child has and how they can best succeed and thrive in that academic school year. So if you're talking about ADHD, then it might be, okay, they need breaks throughout the day. They might need their tests broken down or their curriculum broken down into smaller sections, things like that. The ability to move. We've seen different things like they need Velcro under their desk or they need to sit on a bouncing ball, things like that to help them kind of, to focus and hone it in. So that's an example, but it really is an all-in process, and legally the parent or guardian has to be there to sign on it. But beyond that, it's just so important. That's your child. You want to have input. You want to know what's going on. And when they come home at 3:00, they're with you. And so sometimes you see things that teacher doesn't see, and the teacher sees things that you don't see. And so it's good to communicate together to kind of devise, okay, how can we best help this child during the school day, but also have that continue and carrying on at home, so that everybody's cohesive and unified and helping this student, not only with their learning, but also just their life, to have a better quality of life.
It's all in partnership to support the student, 360 degrees, because, they're
Yes.
what's happening at school and at home. If there isn't a really, solid feedback loop, you could be missing part of the picture and, the accommodations. Why don't we talk about just the process itself and break that down? And then I'll ask my questions at the appropriate time rather than jumping the gun.
So the process of obtaining an IEP or 504?
Like how it's initiated, if like you mentioned, and just now, like it's usually an educator and an administrator, is it ever initiated by parents if they're informed? And then, if there's paperwork or legal steps they have to take, and maybe if there's anything specific about how they're funded or if the funding is different, just to kind of create a roadmap for parents.
So it depends. Sometimes, it depends on the parent. So sometimes it will take the teacher or administrator talking to the parent and saying, hey, we've noticed these behaviors or we have these concerns. Sometimes you have a parent who knows something is wrong or something is not right, and they will approach the school district. So in either instance, whether the teacher contacts the parent or the parent initiates the process, it begins with documentation and it ends with documentation. And there's documentation throughout the entire thing. So much paperwork. But really, it begins with, okay, here's our concern, whatever it may be. And if there's a physician or a specialist required, then that's where it starts, because you have to have that documentation that proves that this child, has dyslexia or has a speech delay or, whatever the need may be. And a lot of times the parents might already know that and they have that documentation. And so they just bring that in, as before the beginning of the school year. But no matter how that plays out, it begins with that documentation from the specialist or physician if that's needed. And then from there, the physician fills out a questionnaire, basically addressing everything that they've noticed and observed about the child. The parent fills out a questionnaire, and the classroom teacher fills out a questionnaire. That all gets submitted to the principal and then the school district, the special education department at the school district. And then there's a meeting that takes place between several different parties, the school administrator, the special education department at the district level and the school level, the parent and guardian, to create this map, this IEP or 504 plan, and agrees upon it's a legally binding federal document that says that the teacher is responsible for implementing these modifications or these interventions, and that, the student will meet these goals by the, first term, second term, third term, fourth term. And they stick to that through the year. There is the ability to get that revised or modified as needed. That's important to note. You're not just locked into that IEP or 504 plan. It's reevaluated annually. But if there was a need that changed in the middle of the year, the parent can absolutely call and say, I think we might need to add this or we take this away. And then they'll have to meet again and agree upon, the best plan for that student. But it's important to note that there is that flexibility in there. It does require that team to meet again. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of students that have IEPs and 504s. So teachers are meeting about that every day, 180 school days out of the year. There are IEP and 504 meetings. So it might not happen the very next day, but it will happen. And those modifications can be changed. Like I said, it's reviewed at the end of each school year to see, hopefully, that child's made progress. So let's change the goals a little bit, let's push them and see what else they can do for next year. If that's not the case, which, sometimes it's not the case, then we just continue with the plan if that's working. But absolutely, parents have a voice in what's happening in their classroom, with their child in their child's classroom, and have a voice in the goals and the interventions and things like that. And the teachers do too. I would say that the teacher and the parent are the key players in that, because they are having the most face time with the student.
So when you mention that the plans are evaluated every year, but let's say a change isn't deemed necessary, do the plans have to be renewed every year? Or if a plan is evaluated and no changes are needed, but the need for it is continued, is there a whole paperwork renewal process, or does a plan stay in place until the needs are deemed no longer needing to be accommodated?
The plan stays in place. There will be a paper sent home for the parent to sign, agreeing that, yes, this will stay in place, this specific plan, and that will happen every year. Every 3 years, it absolutely has to be reevaluated and modified, or possibly exited, where, the child doesn't need these services anymore, so we're exiting from the program. But if there's not a need for changes, then there's just a paper that team signs on at the end of every school year, saying, yes, these services will continue into the next school year.
In the annual evaluation of either of these plans for a particular student, are parents always involved, or is it done at the school level and then communicated to them? So
it's sort of both. The evaluation takes place at the school because the child's at the school, and the teacher's evaluating them, but the parent can provide feedback on that. So if they say, I don't think that they need their small group testing pulled from them because they're still getting anxious about tests, then that can be a conversation between the team, between special education department, teachers, parents, and they can make a decision going forward from there. So it's not like this is the final decision. The parent doesn't get any say. I personally can't ever promise that, parents will get everything that they always want, because sometimes it's unfortunately a staffing issue. It's a time issue, but those needs will be met and modified in some kind of way.
So it sounds like, and again, I know there's so many districts and schools and special circumstances, but from a parent's perspective, they can count on that evaluation and process being initiated at the school for their student if they're on one of these plans. So that there's the initiation point and sort of the management of it and the evaluation. It's not something they have to, be a stimulus for or, initiate themselves.
Right. And if they feel like that those things are not taking place, that is a legal document. And so they can use that as a friendly reminder that these things should be happening for my child every day, in the event that they weren't.
Let's say a family feels really strongly that their student needs some sort of accommodation, but for whatever reason, it doesn't fall into one of these plans. Just as a parent with a student who's had an IEP and a 504, even with those, like there could be outside of school support or resources or just sort of best practices for families. So let's say a family it doesn't get the plan and they still think that their student needs extra support. Do you have any recommendations for outside of school resources that might be helpful? If
you are a parent with a child that has autism and you feel like they're not getting their needs met at their current school, look for, a local autism center or autism specialist that can refer you to extra and additional resources that they may need. So there's a lot of resources out there in your community. I'm a huge advocate for community resources. Talk to other parents who have had the same frustrations or struggles. They can be your biggest, allies and heroes. That, hey, maybe I went through this. Go see this doctor. Go see this specialist, and that can be a huge resource as well. But in this day and age, between everything that's available online and community resources, there's a lot out there to help parents, with whatever their frustrations may be with their students at home.
We're so glad to have this conversation because, our kids, they're older now. They're one's out of school, one's getting close. But I've heard these two plan acronyms or terms forever and really never understood the details. It was just you threw them out there and kind of lumped them together. And it just being informed as a parent so that you can really partner with the school, the teachers to support your students seems so important. Just the team and teamwork or partnership just really sounds like the biggest message out of this conversation, because it's so valuable and the resources there and available. And like you said, it's a legal, federally funded, these programs are federally funded and available. And so, just being informed so that you can make sure your child is getting the best learning, support and outcomes as possible, is really important. So is there any other advice you have or just final thoughts?
My final thought on this is just remember teamwork. I think a lot of times parents go in with the best interest. They are passionate about their child and, they know best, right? And then sometimes you have a frustrated teacher and they know best. And then the school district knows best. And really, it would be most beneficial for the student, for everybody to just work together and use the knowledge and experience that you have with that student, because they're all in different capacities, and really sit down and make a plan that is cohesive and successful for that student to thrive. If you're working against each other and there's tension, just like any relationship ever, it's not going to work. And so really go in with an open mind and think about what would be best for this student from all perspectives and not just one.
We're excited to be able to share this out with folks and so they can benefit from your expertise on this. So we really appreciate your time and just talking to us and educating us on IEPs and 504s.
Well, thank you for having me. I love talking with you, and I do hope this helps.
I know it will. Thank you.